Men like you don't walk into this bank asking for $40 million. The sentence landed across the executive lending office like a hammer against glass. Conversation stopped. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Even the soft jazz playing through Ashford National Bank's ceiling speakers suddenly felt distant, drowned out by the tension spreading through the marble-lined lobby at exactly 11:12 on a rainy Thursday morning in downtown Chicago. Richard Whitmore, senior branch manager, stood behind his polished walnut desk with both palms pressed flat against a stack of loan documents like he was guarding state secrets instead of reviewing an application. His silver tie gleamed beneath the recessed lights. His expression carried the kind of confidence only people with unchecked power wore in public. Across from him sat Darius Cole. Black hoodie, dark jeans, no watch worth bragging about, no assistant hovering nearby, no designer briefcase. Just a quiet man with calm eyes and a loan application Richard clearly never intended to approve. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Darius. Richard flipped through the file again with exaggerated disbelief. 40 million, he repeated louder this time, making sure nearby clients in the VIP lounge could hear every syllable. That's the kind of number serious investors request. Darius didn't blink. He sat back in the leather chair, as if the storm in front of him belonged to someone else. Open page 14, he said evenly. Richard ignored him. Cole Capital, he muttered with a sarcastic chuckle. Funny how these fake firms always sound impressive. A few feet away, a white couple seated near the espresso station exchanged amused looks. One of them whispered something under his breath and smirked. Another client slowly lowered his newspaper just enough to watch. The room was no longer quiet. It was listening. Darius folded his hands together. Calm. Controlled. The kind of calm built over decades of swallowing insults without letting them poison the mission. Richard leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Let me save us both some time, he said. This bank doesn't hand out multi-million-dollar commercial loans to people who walk in dressed like they slept in their car. A low murmur rolled through the lounge. One woman near the window frowned immediately. A younger employee at the far compliance desk looked up sharply from her monitor. Darius tilted his head slightly. You still haven't opened page 14. Richard laughed outright now. And you still haven't realized this isn't some community credit union you can charm your way through. He pushed the application across the desk hard enough for the papers to slide onto the marble floor between them. Silence cracked through the room. Darius looked down at the scattered pages, but didn't move to pick them up. For a second his eyes drifted somewhere far away. 15 years earlier. Southside Chicago. His father standing inside another bank wearing a mechanic's uniform still stained from a 12-hour shift. The loan officer never looked him in the eye either. They denied the refinance request in less than 8 minutes. 3 months later the family home was gone. Same cold lobby. Same polished smiles. Same look that said your skin entered the room before your credentials did. Darius blinked once, and the memory disappeared. Richard tapped the desk impatiently. You people always think money changes everything. The younger compliance analyst froze completely at those words. Her badge read Sophia Bennett. 26 years old. MBA from Northwestern. Smart enough to recognize when a conversation stopped being professional and started becoming dangerous. She glanced toward Richard nervously, then toward Darius. Something about him felt familiar. Not his clothes. Not his face exactly. His stillness. Men asking for $40 million usually sweated under pressure. This man looked like pressure answered to him. Richard stood up slowly now, towering over the desk. Here's what's going to happen, he said. Security is going to escort you out before you embarrass yourself any further. Darius finally looked directly at him. Did you deny the loan before or after deciding who I was? Richard smirked. I decided the second you walked in. That line hit the room harder than he intended. Even the couple by the espresso machine stopped smiling. Sophia swallowed hard and quietly turned her monitor toward herself again. She typed fast. Cole Capital. Search. The system loaded. Then froze. Her eyes widened instantly. Restricted acquisition files. Executive clearance tags. Emergency shareholder documentation. Ashford National Bank. Pending purchase authorization. Sophia's heartbeat stumbled. She looked up at Darius again, then back at the screen like she hoped the information would disappear. It didn't. Richard kept talking, unaware the floor beneath his authority had already begun cracking. $40 million, he scoffed. Men from neighborhoods like yours don't qualify for numbers like that. Darius slowly stood to his feet. Not angry, not loud, just steady enough to make the room nervous. Rain hammered against the giant glass windows overlooking LaSalle Street. Somewhere behind the front desk, a printer kept spitting paper no one bothered collecting anymore. Every eye in the lounge locked onto the man in the black hoodie. Darius adjusted one cuff calmly and said, almost under his breath, "That may end up being the most expensive sentence you've ever spoken." Sophia Bennett could feel her pulse inside her throat as the acquisition file remained frozen on her monitor. Restricted executive access. Pending emergency board approval. Lead investor. Cole Capital Holdings. Primary buyer authorization awaiting final signature. She looked up slowly at Darius Cole, standing in the center of the executive lending office, while rainwater crawled down the massive glass windows behind him like the city itself was holding its breath. Richard Whitmore still had no idea who he was talking to. That was the terrifying part. The branch manager adjusted his cuffs and gave a short laugh, meant to reassure the room that he remained in control. "I am done wasting my morning on this nonsense," he announced loudly. "Security will handle the rest." A uniformed security officer near the front entrance glanced over uncertainly, but did not move yet. Something in the atmosphere had shifted. The room no longer felt like a bank lobby. It felt like the final minutes before a verdict. Darius calmly bent down and picked up the scattered loan papers one at a time. Slow, precise, not embarrassed, not rushed, like a man collecting evidence instead of recovering from humiliation. Richard shook his head in disgust. "You should have stayed online with the fake applications and fantasy business plans," he muttered. "People come in here every week pretending to be investors." Darius slid the papers back into alignment and placed them neatly on the desk. "Pretending is expensive," he said quietly. Richard smirked. "So is trespassing in executive banking without real assets." Across the lounge, a middle-aged black woman seated near the investment office finally spoke under her breath. "This is wrong." Her husband nodded silently beside her. Two younger clients pretending to scroll through their phones were no longer pretending at all. Every eye remained fixed on the confrontation unfolding near the executive offices. Sophia could not stop staring at the acquisition file. The deeper she searched, the worse it became. Debt restructuring agreements. Emergency liquidity injections. Internal warnings from the board. Ashford National Bank was hanging by a thread financially, and Cole Capital was the only reason it had not collapsed publicly 3 months earlier. Her hands trembled over the keyboard. Darius was not applying for a loan because he needed money. He was here because he was deciding whether the institution deserved saving at all. Richard leaned forward across the desk. "Let me explain something to you," he said. "Men like me can spot fraud in under 60 seconds. Darius looked at him carefully. "And men like you mistake confidence for ownership." Richard's smile faded slightly at that response. Not because it was loud, because it was controlled. There was no anger in Darius's voice. No desperation either. Just certainty. The kind that made powerful people uncomfortable. 15 years earlier, Darius had stood inside a cramped apartment kitchen while his father opened another foreclosure notice beneath a flickering ceiling light. He still remembered the silence after reading it. His mother staring out the window, pretending not to cry. His father saying only one sentence before folding the paper in half. "They already decided who we were before we walked through the door." That sentence built something dangerous inside Darius. Not rage. Precision. Every investment. Every acquisition. Every sleepless night studying financial markets while others slept eventually led to this exact room. Same polished floors. Same quiet judgment. Different outcome waiting beneath the surface. Richard turned toward the security officer again. "Sir, I need this individual escorted out immediately." The officer hesitated. "Has he threatened anyone?" Richard's jaw tightened. "No." "Has he refused to leave?" "Not yet." The hesitation spread visibly across the room. Darius remained perfectly still beside the desk while the rain outside intensified, thunder rolling faintly somewhere over the Chicago skyline. Sophia swallowed hard and finally stood from her workstation. "Richard," she said carefully, "maybe we should review the account structure again before escalating this." Richard snapped toward her immediately. Sit down, Sophia. I just think there may be additional documentation attached to his file. I said sit down. The sharpness in his voice cut through the room like broken glass. Sophia slowly lowered herself back into her chair, but her eyes never left Darius. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Men who built billion-dollar firms learned to read fear long before they learned balance sheets. One of the younger bankers whispered quietly to another employee, "Who is this guy?" No answer came. Darius finally reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out his phone. No dramatic movement. No threats. He unlocked the screen calmly and typed one short message before placing the phone back down beside the loan application. Richard laughed again. Calling somebody to rescue you? Darius looked at the branch manager for a long moment before answering. No, he said softly. I am giving your board one last chance to rescue you. The room went silent again. Even the printer behind the teller stations finally stopped humming. Sophia's monitor refreshed automatically. New notification. Emergency board session initiated. Executive acquisition protocol activated. Her face lost color instantly. The timestamp read 11:24 a.m., exactly 12 minutes after Darius Cole had walked into the bank wearing a black hoodie and asking for a $40 million loan. The air inside Ashford National Bank had changed so completely that even the employees could feel it pressing against their skin. At 11:26 a.m., the executive lounge no longer sounded like a place where million-dollar transactions happened quietly behind polished smiles. It sounded fragile. Nervous whispers rolled across the marble floor while clients pretended not to stare at the man in the black hoodie standing beside Richard Whitmore's desk. Darius Cole remained calm, one hand resting lightly against the leather chair in front of him while storm clouds darkened the Chicago skyline outside the 40-foot windows. Richard, meanwhile, was beginning to sweat beneath his collar, though he still wore the expression of someone refusing to admit the room had turned against him. Enough of this, he snapped suddenly. I am done entertaining whatever little stunt you think this is. He turned sharply toward the security officer again. Escort him out now. The officer hesitated a second time. Sir, he has not violated policy. Richard's voice hardened. I decide policy in this branch. Darius finally looked directly at the guard. You might want to remember he said that. The sentence landed quietly, but the effect was immediate. Several employees exchanged uneasy looks. One of the junior tellers slowly lowered her headset. The older black couple near the espresso station had stopped pretending to drink their coffee entirely. Even the white businessman who had smirked earlier now looked uncomfortable watching the confrontation escalate. Richard pointed toward the front doors. You walk in here wearing street clothes asking for $40 million and expect respect. Darius answered without raising his voice. Respect is not something you hand out based on fabric. Richard laughed bitterly. No, it is based on credibility. Sophia Bennett stared at the flashing notification on her monitor as another internal alert appeared. Executive Acquisition Protocol Escalation Level 2. Emergency Legal Review initiated. Her stomach tightened. She quietly clicked deeper into the file and saw names she recognized immediately from financial television interviews and Forbes rankings. Corporate attorneys, federal restructuring consultants, senior board members, all connected to one man standing 10 feet away while being treated like a criminal inside a bank he was preparing to acquire. She looked up at Richard, almost wanting to save him from himself. Richard, she said carefully again, I really think we need to pause this. Why? He barked. Because you suddenly sympathize with him? The accusation echoed harder than he intended. Sophia's face flushed immediately. Darius watched the exchange in silence. Richard stepped around the desk now, confidence returning because movement made him feel powerful again. You know what this really is? He said loudly enough for nearby clients to hear. Every few months somebody comes in here pretending to be bigger than they are. Fake companies. Fake portfolios. Fake confidence. He looked Darius directly in the eyes. And every time it is the same story. Darius tilted his head slightly. Go ahead, he said softly. Finish the sentence. Richard stopped. The room stopped with him. He realized too late that every phone near the investment lounge had quietly tilted upward. Not openly recording yet. Just ready. A young Latino financial advisor near the teller stations shifted uneasily and whispered to a coworker, This feels bad. The coworker nodded without taking her eyes off Darius. 15 years earlier, Darius had stood outside a downtown office building after being rejected from an internship despite graduating top of his finance class. He remembered the recruiter smiling politely before saying the company was looking for someone who better match the culture, better match the image. He remembered sitting inside his car afterward, gripping the steering wheel, while rain hit the windshield exactly like it was hitting Ashford National now. That rejection became the first company he ever bought out years later. Not because he wanted revenge, because he wanted leverage. Richard suddenly reached down and picked up the loan file from the desk again. $40 million, he repeated mockingly while flipping pages. Do you know how ridiculous this looks? Then he stopped flipping. One page caught his attention for half a second. Net worth estimates, asset structures, corporate holdings. Richard frowned slightly before slamming the file shut again without fully reading it. Pride moved faster than caution. Actually, he scoffed, it does not matter what is in here. He tossed the folder back onto the desk. I already know enough. Darius gave a faint nod. That is usually how prejudice works. The sentence hit like a crack through glass. Nobody spoke after that. Sophia's monitor refreshed again. New internal message from executive headquarters. Mandatory board attendance requested immediately. Subject line, Coal Capital Emergency Acquisition Vote. Her breathing became shallow. The timestamp read 11:29 a.m. Somewhere upstairs, people far more powerful than Richard Whitmore were beginning to panic. But downstairs, the branch manager still believed he controlled the room. He straightened his tie again and motioned toward the front entrance. Last chance, he warned. Leave now before this gets embarrassing. Darius slowly reached into his hoodie pocket once more and removed a matte black phone. No designer logo. No flashy case. Just a simple device held by steady hands. He looked at the screen briefly before speaking. Interesting choice of words, he said quietly. Richard frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Darius slipped the phone back into his pocket and glanced around the executive lounge one slow time, meeting the eyes of the clients, the tellers, the guards, the nervous employees, and finally Sophia Bennett, whose expression had already shifted from concern to realization. Then Darius looked back at Richard and said, because in exactly 3 minutes, this room is going to learn who should really be embarrassed. At 11:31 a.m., the executive lounge inside Ashford National Bank felt less like a financial institution and more like a courtroom waiting for a sentence nobody was prepared to hear. Rain hammered harder against the glass walls overlooking downtown Chicago while clients stood frozen beside untouched coffees and glowing phone screens. Darius Cole remained exactly where he had been the entire time, calm beside Richard Whitmore's desk, hands relaxed at his sides, expression unreadable. Richard, however, was unraveling in tiny visible pieces. The confidence in his posture no longer matched the tension creeping into his face. 3 minutes, he repeated with a forced laugh. What exactly is supposed to happen in 3 minutes? Darius answered quietly. The truth catches up. Richard scoffed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. You really think cryptic little comments make you sound powerful? Darius did not respond. That silence bothered Richard more than insults would have. Across the lounge, Sophia Bennett stared at her monitor as another restricted document opened automatically. Emergency Acquisition Briefing. Internal code name, Project Blackstone. Her breathing stopped for half a second when she saw the authorization line waiting at the bottom of the file. Darius Cole. Final acquiring authority. Estimated controlling ownership after transfer, 51%. Her fingers trembled above the keyboard. The bank was already halfway sold. Richard simply did not know it yet. Sophia slowly stood from her workstation again, this time unable to stay quiet any longer. Richard, she said carefully, you need to stop this conversation right now. Every head turned toward her. Richard blinked in disbelief. Excuse me. I am serious. Her voice shook slightly, but remained clear. There are files attached to this situation you have not reviewed. Richard laughed sharply. What files? Sophia hesitated. The room itself seemed to lean toward her, waiting for the answer. She looked at Darius once. He gave no signal. No rescue. No interruption. Just calm observation. Richard stepped closer toward Sophia now. You are a junior analyst, he snapped. You do not interrupt executive decisions because some guy in a hoodie makes you nervous. Sophia swallowed hard. He is not making me nervous, she said quietly. Your behavior is. That sentence hit the room with the force of a slammed door. One of the tellers near the back counter lowered her eyes immediately. The older black woman by the espresso station nodded once under her breath, like someone finally said what everybody else was afraid to. Richard's face reddened. "You are out of line." Sophia looked toward the monitor again. "No," she answered softly. "I think we all are." Darius watched her carefully now. Not surprised. Just thoughtful. He had seen this moment before in different buildings across different cities. There was always one person inside the machine who finally recognized the machine was wrong. Usually younger. Usually underestimated. Usually terrified. 15 years earlier, Darius had been 24 years old standing inside a Manhattan investment office while senior executives laughed at his first acquisition proposal. One man had actually leaned back in his chair and asked whether Darius was delivering documents instead of pitching a deal. Everyone laughed except a young assistant sitting near the wall quietly taking notes. After the meeting, she followed Darius into the hallway and whispered, "They did not even read your numbers." 3 years later, she became the first executive he hired when coal capital exploded nationally. People willing to speak when silence felt safer mattered to him. Richard grabbed the loan file again and slapped it against the desk. "I am done with this fantasy." He pointed toward the front entrance once more. "You leave now, or security escorts you out." The guard near the door still did not move. Darius noticed immediately. Richard noticed too. That hesitation frightened him more than he wanted to admit. "Did you hear me?" Richard barked toward the guard. The officer shifted awkwardly. "Sir, maybe we should wait for corporate before escalating further." Richard stared at him in disbelief. "Corporate?" Sophia closed her eyes briefly. "Too late." Richard whipped around toward her. "What did you do?" "Nothing," she answered honestly. "Corporate already knows." The room fell completely silent after that. Somewhere behind the teller stations, a pin dropped onto marble and echoed louder than it should have. Richard turned slowly toward Darius again, but this time the certainty was gone from his face. Tiny cracks had appeared beneath the surface of his authority. Darius remained still. Rain rolled down the glass behind him in silver streaks, while thunder rumbled low over the city skyline. He looked less like a customer now and more like someone inspecting damage before deciding whether to rebuild or demolish. Sophia's monitor refreshed again. New alert. Emergency board members connected live. Executive legal counsel active. Compliance lockdown pending authorization. She stared at the screen in disbelief. Richard noticed the color drain from her face. "What are you looking at?" he demanded. Sophia looked at him carefully, almost sympathetically. "The reason you should have opened page 14. Richard snatched the loan file open violently and flipped pages fast for the first time since Darius walked into the bank. His eyes scanned numbers. Asset reports. Commercial holdings. Aviation investments. Real estate portfolios. Liquidity statements larger than some regional banks carried entirely. Richard's breathing slowed, then stopped. His eyes landed on the final page. Estimated net worth. $8.4 billion. The room seemed to tilt beneath him. Slowly, almost mechanically, Richard lifted his eyes toward Darius Cole, standing silently across the desk. Darius gave the faintest nod imaginable and said, "Now you are finally reading the right file." Richard Whitmore stared at the number on the final page like his brain refused to translate it into reality. $8.4 billion. The figure sat beneath Darius Cole's name in clean black letters while rain rattled against the towering windows behind them. For several long seconds, the executive lounge forgot how to breathe. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the low hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounded too loud inside the silence, swallowing the room. Richard slowly lifted his eyes from the file back toward Darius. The arrogance that had carried him through the last 20 minutes was cracking apart in real time. "This," he muttered weakly, flipping back through the pages again. "This cannot be accurate." Darius remained calm. "You should have started there before judging the man holding the folder." Sophia Bennett watched the entire scene unfold with her hands pressed tightly against the edge of her desk. She could almost see the exact moment Richard realized the danger he was standing in. Not just financially, publicly, morally. The branch manager who had spent 20 years deciding who looked trustworthy suddenly looked like a man trapped inside his own reflection. Richard cleared his throat and straightened his tie again, desperate to recover authority before the room fully turned against him. "Well," he said stiffly, If these documents are legitimate, then perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. A quiet scoff came from the older black woman near the espresso station. Another client shook his head slowly. Darius looked at Richard without expression. A misunderstanding happens by accident, he said softly. You made a decision. Richard forced a thin smile. Mr. Cole, I think emotions are escalating unnecessarily. Emotions? Darius repeated calmly. You called me a fraud before opening my financials. Richard glanced nervously around the room, now aware that every face watching him had changed. The same clients who had remained silent earlier were no longer standing with him. One younger man near the investment office quietly raised his phone and began recording. Another customer whispered, "This is unbelievable." Richard noticed immediately. Fear flickered behind his eyes. 15 years earlier, Darius had sat inside a luxury dealership waiting nearly 40 minutes, while salesmen ignored him completely despite arriving first. A white customer who entered after him received coffee, a showroom tour, and immediate service. When Darius finally asked whether someone could help him, the salesman smiled politely and said, "Those cars start around $200,000. Darius bought the dealership chain 6 years later through a holding company. Not because of anger, because systems only changed when ownership changed. Richard closed the loan file carefully now, suddenly treating it like something fragile. "Mr. Cole," he began again, voice softer this time. "Perhaps we should move this discussion into a private office." Darius shook his head once. "Interesting." Richard swallowed. "What is?" "You were comfortable humiliating me publicly." Darius glanced around the executive lounge slowly. "Now you want privacy." The sentence landed like a blade. Several clients looked away awkwardly. Sophia felt her stomach tighten because she knew exactly what was happening. The power in the room had already shifted. Richard just had not accepted it yet. The branch manager took a breath and lowered his voice further. "Look, if anything I said came across the wrong way, it came across exactly the way you intended." Richard stopped speaking entirely after that. The security officer near the front entrance remained frozen in place, no longer sure who he was supposed to protect. Darius stepped closer toward the desk now, not aggressive, just steady enough to force Richard backward half a step without realizing it. "You looked at my clothes before my credentials," Darius said quietly. "You looked at my skin before my assets." Nobody interrupted him. Nobody could. "And the moment you believed I had no power," Darius continued, "you stopped seeing me as worthy of respect." The older black woman near the coffee station nodded slowly with tears gathering in her eyes. Her husband placed a hand gently over hers. Across the room, one of the younger bankers lowered his head, completely unable to defend what had happened. Richard tried again. "I think we are taking this too personally." Darius gave the faintest smile imaginable. Not warm, not cruel, just tired. People always say that after they get caught. The room went dead silent. Sophia's monitor refreshed again with another alert. Executive Legal Counsel arriving on site. Board vote entering final stage. Estimated acquisition completion. Pending authorization from Darius Cole. Her pulse jumped. They were minutes away now. Richard noticed the expression on her face immediately. "What now?" he asked sharply. Sophia hesitated, then finally answered the truth. "The board is finalizing the takeover." Richard blinked. "What takeover?" Nobody spoke for a second. Rain streaked down the windows in silver lines behind Darius, while downtown Chicago disappeared beneath storm clouds. Then Darius slowly reached into his hoodie pocket one final time and pulled out his phone as it vibrated quietly in his hand. He looked down at the screen. Incoming call. Vanessa Grant, Chief Legal Officer. Darius answered calmly and placed the phone near his ear. "Tell me," he said softly. Vanessa's voice came through clear enough for Sophia to hear from several feet away. "The board is ready, Mr. Cole. All we need is your authorization to complete the acquisition of Ashford National Bank." Richard Whitmore's face lost every remaining trace of color. The silence after Vanessa Grant's words felt almost unnatural, like the entire executive lounge had slipped underwater. Richard Whitmore stood motionless behind his desk, staring at Darius Cole with the expression of a man watching reality detach itself from everything he thought he understood. Around them, the marble floors, the polished glass offices, the quiet luxury of Ashford National Bank suddenly looked smaller somehow. Fragile. Temporary. Darius kept the phone against his ear while rain thundered against the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. "How many votes remain?" he asked calmly. Vanessa answered immediately. "None. The board approved unanimous transfer authority 2 minutes ago. The acquisition is waiting only for your final authorization." Richard inhaled sharply. Sophia Bennett lowered herself slowly into her chair because her knees no longer trusted the floor beneath her. One of the clients near the espresso station whispered, "Oh my God." Another quietly stepped farther away from Richard's desk like distance might protect them from what was happening. Darius remained perfectly composed. No smile. No celebration. Just stillness. The kind built from years of learning that real power did not need volume. Richard finally found his voice again, though it sounded thinner now. "Mr. Cole," he stammered, "if there has been any misunderstanding today, I assure you." Darius raised one finger slightly, and Richard stopped talking instantly. The room noticed that too. "Vanessa," Darius continued into the phone, "is executive compliance active?" "Yes," she answered. "Human resources, legal, and shareholder oversight are all connected live." Sophia's monitor refreshed again. New windows opened automatically across the internal banking system. Emergency executive oversight initiated. Branch conduct review active. Temporary management authority suspended pending acquisition completion. Her pulse jumped. Upstairs, corporate leadership was already moving faster than the people downstairs could comprehend. Richard saw the change happen on Sophia's monitor, and his face tightened with panic. "What does suspended mean?" he asked weakly. Sophia looked at him carefully before answering. "It means this branch no longer belongs to you." The sentence settled heavily across the room. Darius finally took a slow step away from the desk and looked around the executive lounge. The clients watching. The employees frozen behind teller stations. The guards uncertain where to stand. The people who had stayed silent. The people who had started recording. Every face carried a different version of the same realization. The man they dismissed the moment he walked through the door was now deciding the future of the bank itself. 15 years earlier, Darius had waited outside a conference room in Boston after a corporate investor refused to shake his hand during a merger meeting. One executive actually asked whether he was part of the hotel catering staff. Darius remembered standing in the elevator afterwards staring at his own reflection in silence, while wealthy men upstairs discussed whether he looked trustworthy enough to manage capital. That humiliation became the first billion-dollar acquisition he ever closed. Not because he needed revenge, because he understood something they did not. Ownership rewrote conversations faster than anger ever could. Richard stepped around the desk slowly now, abandoning the posture of authority entirely. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully, "I would appreciate the opportunity to apologize privately." Darius looked directly at him. "Why privately?" Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The answer was obvious to everyone standing there. Because public humiliation felt different once the audience stopped being useful. Darius slipped one hand into the pocket of his hoodie and glanced again toward the rain-covered skyline beyond the windows. "You made your assumptions publicly," he said quietly. "Let the truth stay public too." A young teller near the back counter looked down immediately ashamed. The older black woman by the coffee station wiped tears from her face without speaking. Richard's shoulders sagged slightly as the full weight of the room turned against him. "I was following protocol," he muttered weakly. Darius gave the faintest shake of his head. "Protocol did not tell you to call me a fraud before opening my file." Silence. "Protocol did not tell you to judge my credibility based on a hoodie." More silence. "And protocol definitely did not tell you that men from my neighborhood do not deserve $40 million loans." Richard could not look him in the eyes anymore. Sophia stared down at her monitor again as another alert flashed across the system. Executive identity confirmation complete. Ownership transfer initiating. Internal branch authority updating. The timestamp read 11:38 a.m., less than 30 minutes after Darius Cole first walked into the bank. Vanessa's voice came through the phone once more. "Mr. Cole, legal counsel is requesting final verbal authorization." Darius stood quietly for one long second. The entire executive lounge waited with him. Rain hammered the windows. Phones remained raised. Somewhere in the distance, downtown sirens echoed faintly beneath the storm. Then Darius finally spoke. Calm. Certain. Irreversible. Authorize the acquisition. Across the room, every employee computer refreshed simultaneously. Screens flickered. Access permissions updated. New ownership notifications rolled through the internal system like shockwaves. Sophia's monitor displayed the headline first. Cole Capital completes acquisition of Ashford National Bank. Richard Whitmore stared at the message in absolute disbelief while the badge clipped to his belt suddenly emitted a sharp red flash, followed by a soft mechanical tone. Access restricted. The room went completely silent as Richard slowly looked down at the badge, no longer recognizing him. The red warning light blinking across Richard Whitmore's access badge looked almost unreal against the polished executive lounge of Ashford National Bank. Access restricted. The words glowed for 2 long seconds before the badge emitted another sharp tone and went dark completely. Nobody moved after that. The room stood frozen beneath the sound of rain crashing against the glass walls while Richard stared downward like his own identity had just rejected him. Darius Cole remained calm beside the desk, one hand resting lightly inside the pocket of his black hoodie, expression controlled and unreadable. Around them, every employee computer in the branch continued refreshing with new ownership notifications. Cole Capital executive transfer complete. Branch authority updated. Emergency compliance review active. Sophia Bennett watched the alerts spread through the system like shockwaves moving beneath water. One by one, the screens changed across the bank. One by one, employees realized the institution they worked for no longer belonged to the people they answered to 30 minutes earlier. Richard finally looked up again, pale beneath the executive lighting. "This cannot be happening," he whispered. Darius answered quietly. "It already happened." The sentence landed harder than any raised voice could have. Across the lounge, the young man recording with his phone lowered it slightly and shook his head in disbelief. The older black woman near the coffee station wiped her face carefully while her husband stared directly at Richard with years of buried frustration sitting behind his eyes. One teller near the back counter muttered under her breath, "He really bought the bank." Darius slowly turned his attention toward the clients and employees gathered around the executive offices. "The problem was never the loan," he said calmly. "The problem was who he thought deserved one." Nobody interrupted him. Even the storm outside seemed quieter now. Richard tried to straighten his tie again, but his hands would not stay steady. "Mr. Cole," he said weakly, "I would appreciate the opportunity to explain myself." Darius looked at him carefully for a long moment. "You already did." Richard swallowed hard. "I made assumptions." "No," Darius corrected softly. "You made judgments." Silence rolled through the room again. The difference between those two words sat heavy in the air. 15 years earlier, Darius had walked into a private investment dinner wearing an off-the-rack navy suit because it was the only one he could afford after launching his first company. A white executive looked him over and handed him an empty tray, believing he worked catering. Darius remembered taking the tray without saying a word because at 27, he understood something powerful people often forgot. Humiliation reveals character faster than success ever will. 2 years later, he bought controlling interest in that executive's struggling firm during a recession. Not because of revenge, because systems built on arrogance eventually collapse under their own weight. Richard took one uncertain step forward now. "I never intended." "Stop." Darius did not raise his voice, but the single word stopped Richard immediately. Every eye in the room shifted back toward Darius again. Calm authority carried differently now that everyone understood who he was. "You intended every sentence," Darius continued quietly. "You intended every look, every assumption, every dismissal." Richard lowered his eyes. Darius glanced toward the employees standing behind the teller counters. You looked at a black man in a hoodie and decided he could not possibly belong in executive banking. His gaze shifted toward the clients near the coffee station. You saw confidence and called it fraud. Then back toward Richard. And the moment you believed I had no power, you became comfortable humiliating me publicly. Nobody defended Richard anymore. Nobody even tried. The security officer near the entrance slowly unclipped his own radio from his belt and stepped farther away from the executive desk, understanding instinctively which side of authority now mattered. Sophia's monitor refreshed again with another alert. Immediate executive conference call commencing. Branch management review mandatory. She looked toward Darius, almost with disbelief herself. He stood there so simply. No expensive suit. No entourage, no raised voice. Yet the entire institution had shifted around him in less than half an hour. That was what unsettled people most about real power. It rarely announced itself before it arrived. Vanessa Grant's voice returned through the phone, still resting in Darius's hand. Mr. Cole, legal counsel, is requesting instruction regarding current branch leadership. Every employee in the executive lounge went still. Richard's breathing visibly changed. Darius looked toward him calmly. Not angry, not triumphant, just finished. Richard Whitmore, Darius said evenly. You denied my loan before reviewing my assets. Richard closed his eyes briefly. You publicly questioned my credibility based on my appearance. Another painful silence. And you used the phrase, people from your neighborhood, while representing a financial institution asking for my capital. Several employees lowered their heads completely after hearing the words repeated aloud. The ugliness sounded worse the second time. Darius finally lifted the phone slightly toward his ear again. Vanessa, he said calmly, remove Richard Whitmore from all managerial authority effective immediately pending full compliance investigation. Richard's head snapped upward. Please, he whispered before he could stop himself. The room heard that too. Darius looked directly at him one final time. You mistook silence for weakness, he said quietly. That was your last professional mistake. At that exact moment, the executive office doors behind the lounge opened, and 3 members of Ashford National's corporate legal team stepped inside, wearing dark suits and carrying digital tablets. The entire branch fell completely silent as they walked directly past Richard Whitmore, without acknowledging him once, and stopped in front of Darius Cole instead. Then the senior attorney extended his hand respectfully and said, Welcome to Ashford National Bank, Mr. Cole. The 3 corporate attorneys stood beside Darius Cole with the quiet precision of people accustomed to walking into collapsing rooms and taking control before panic spread further. Their dark coats still carried drops of rain from outside, while digital tablets glowed in their hands beneath the executive lighting of Ashford National Bank. Nobody in the lounge looked at Richard Whitmore anymore. That shift alone seemed to break something inside him. 25 minutes earlier, every employee in the branch had followed his voice without hesitation. Now people stepped around him like he was already gone. The senior attorney adjusted his glasses and addressed Darius respectfully. Mr. Cole, the acquisition has been fully executed. All branch authority now falls under Cole Capital oversight effective immediately. Darius nodded once. Understood. The attorney glanced briefly toward Richard. Compliance requested immediate review regarding today's conduct. Richard's jaw tightened instinctively. There is no need to make this public, he muttered. Darius looked at him calmly. You made it public the moment you decided I did not belong here. Silence swept across the lounge again. One of the younger tellers quietly turned away, wiping tears from her eyes because the truth sounded heavier now that nobody could hide behind policy anymore. Sophia Bennett remained seated at her workstation, staring at the refreshed system notifications flooding across every monitor in the branch. Internal executive review active. Branch management suspended. Mandatory discrimination audit initiated. She had worked at Ashford National for almost 4 years and had never seen corporate systems move this fast. That alone told her how serious the situation truly was. The older black couple near the coffee station slowly stood to leave, but paused before walking out. The husband looked directly at Darius and nodded once with quiet respect. No speech. No performance. Just recognition. Darius returned the nod gently. Across the lobby, several younger clients had openly started recording now. One whispered, "This is going viral before lunch." Another shook his head and said softly, "He bought the entire bank in the middle of the argument." Richard heard every word. His breathing grew uneven beneath the crushing weight of public humiliation finally turning back toward him. 15 years earlier, Darius had stood in line outside a private finance summit in Atlanta, while security repeatedly questioned whether he belonged inside despite his registration badge hanging visibly around his neck. 3 white attendees walked past unchecked while he remained held at the entrance for almost 20 minutes. One guard finally looked at him and said, "You understand why we have to verify these things." Darius remembered smiling politely, while humiliation burned through him like acid beneath calm water. That same summit later invited him back as keynote speaker after Cole Capital became one of the fastest-growing firms in the country. He accepted the invitation only because he wanted young black entrepreneurs in the audience to see something different than rejection. Darius turned slightly toward the corporate attorneys. I want every employee in this branch retrained under the new conduct standards immediately, he said calmly. And I want a full review of prior discrimination complaints filed against executive management. Richard's face tightened again. Sophia looked up sharply because she already knew what those complaints would reveal. The patterns, the selective treatment. The clients quietly pushed aside while others received smiles and coffee. Darius continued. No customer should ever have to prove they belong before being treated with dignity. The senior attorney nodded immediately while making notes on his tablet. It will be done. Richard finally stepped forward again, unable to hold his silence any longer. Mr. Cole, he said carefully, I have worked in banking for 22 years. Darius looked at him, but said nothing. Richard swallowed hard. One mistake should not erase an entire career. The room listened carefully because everyone understood that sentence was no longer just about employment. It was about accountability. Darius remained quiet for several seconds before answering. One mistake does not destroy a career, he said softly. But repeated choices reveal character. Richard lowered his eyes again. Nobody defended him now. Not the employees. Not the clients. Not even the security officer standing near the front entrance who quietly unclipped Richard's former executive access credentials from the internal system at the request of corporate counsel. The symbolic shift felt enormous. The man who once controlled the branch could no longer even open his own office door. Sophia's monitor flashed again with another incoming message from executive headquarters. Interim branch director assigned, pending restructuring. Mandatory leadership review scheduled. Diversity Compliance Task Force activated. She stared at the words, almost in disbelief. Darius was not just buying a bank. He was rebuilding the culture that allowed moments like this to happen. Rain continued crashing against the glass walls while the Chicago skyline faded beneath gray storm clouds outside. Inside the executive lounge, the atmosphere felt completely transformed. The arrogance that filled the room earlier had collapsed into something quieter, more honest. One of the younger employees near the teller line finally spoke under her breath. He never yelled once. The older woman beside her nodded slowly. That is real power. Darius glanced around the branch one final time. The frightened employees. The embarrassed executives. The clients still holding phones in stunned silence. Then his eyes settled briefly on Sophia Bennett. She had been the first person inside the system willing to speak when staying silent would have been easier. Darius noticed things like that. He always had. The senior attorney stepped closer again. Mr. Cole, transportation is waiting whenever you are ready. Darius nodded but did not move immediately. Instead, he looked toward Richard Whitmore one last time, standing alone beside the desk, where he once believed authority protected him from consequence. Then Darius spoke quietly enough that the room leaned in to hear every word. You saw a black man in a hoodie and assumed I needed your approval, he said calmly. What you never realized was this bank needed mine. The executive lounge of Ashford National Bank no longer looked like the same room Darius Cole had walked into less than an hour earlier. The polished marble floors were still spotless. The rain still rolled down the giant windows overlooking downtown Chicago. The soft jazz still drifted quietly through hidden speakers above the investment offices. But something fundamental had changed in the air itself. The arrogance was gone. The certainty was gone. All that remained was silence and the uncomfortable weight of truth sitting in the center of the room, where Darius stood calmly in a black hoodie beside the desk that once rejected him. Nobody rushed anymore. Nobody whispered jokes. Nobody questioned whether he belonged. Because now every person inside the branch understood the same thing. The man they dismissed had been the most powerful person in the building the entire time. Richard Whitmore stood alone near his former desk, while employees quietly avoided eye contact with him. The glowing executive access panel beside his office remained red. Locked out. Final. The branch manager who once controlled approvals, accounts, and authority now looked smaller somehow, like the room itself had stripped away everything except the choices he made when he thought nobody important was watching. Darius glanced once toward the rain outside before slipping his phone into the pocket of his hoodie. The storm over Chicago had begun to lighten slightly. Gray clouds slowly shifted apart above the skyline, while thin streaks of sunlight started pushing through the glass towers downtown. Sophia Bennett noticed it immediately. The timing felt almost unreal. 15 years earlier, Darius had stood outside a neighborhood bank with his mother after another loan denial pushed their family deeper into financial collapse. He remembered watching her fold rejection papers carefully into her purse so nobody nearby would see her hands shaking. She never yelled, never caused a scene. She simply looked at him and said quietly, "Never let people decide your value before you decide it yourself." That sentence stayed with him longer than the foreclosure notices, longer than the insults, longer than the humiliation. It became the foundation beneath every company he built afterward. One of the younger tellers near the back counter slowly stepped forward now, nervous but determined. "Mr. Cole," she said softly, "I just wanted to say I am sorry for what happened today." Darius looked at her kindly. "You did not create the culture," he answered, "but you will help decide whether it changes." The young teller nodded slowly with tears in her eyes. Across the lounge, several employees lowered their heads because deep down they understood exactly what he meant. Systems survive when good people convince themselves silence is safer than speaking. Sophia closed her monitor carefully and stood from her desk. "Mr. Cole," she said, "for what it is worth, I should have spoken sooner." Darius studied her for a moment before answering. "You spoke when it mattered." Her expression tightened emotionally at those words because she knew how easily fear could have kept her quiet. The senior attorney from corporate stepped forward once more. "Transportation is ready, sir. The board also requested a press statement by this afternoon." Darius nodded slightly, but did not move toward the exit yet. Instead, he turned slowly and looked around the executive lounge one final time. The clients still holding phones. The employees standing silently behind counters. The guards no longer pretending authority belonged only to uniforms and titles. The older black couple near the coffee station watching him with visible pride in their eyes. The room felt different now. Awake somehow. Darius finally spoke again, his voice calm enough that people instinctively leaned closer to hear it. "Too many people confuse wealth with worth," he said quietly. "And too many institutions decide who deserves dignity before they ever review character." Nobody interrupted him. "Today was never about a $40 million loan," he continued. "It was about what happens when bias sits behind a desk pretending to be professionalism." Richard lowered his head completely after hearing that. Darius looked toward him one last time. Not cruelly, not triumphantly, just honestly. "You looked at me and saw risk," he said softly. "I looked at this bank and saw potential." The room stood perfectly silent beneath the sound of rain fading outside. Then Darius continued toward the front entrance at an unhurried pace, while the corporate legal team followed behind him. Employees stepped aside instinctively as he passed. Some nodded respectfully. Others simply watched in stunned silence, unable to process how quickly power had shifted. Sophia remained near her workstation staring after him, while sunlight finally broke through the storm clouds outside, casting long reflections across the marble floor. Just before reaching the doors, Darius stopped briefly without turning around. "I did not raise my voice today," he said calmly. "I raised the standard." Then he stepped out into the Chicago afternoon, while the glass doors closed softly behind him and the entire executive lounge remained frozen in the silence he left behind.